Hi, this is Russell from the Asia Education team, and I'm here to talk to you about digital transformation and the device, and specifically, how does Surface help you get more out of your digital transformation efforts? Okay, let's start off by talking about what is digital transformation and why do people embrace digital transformation? Well, first and foremost, what happened in the last 12 to 18 months is that we had a change that was thrust upon us in COVID, and a lot of people in education and a lot of people in IT had to scramble basically to enable us to continue to work in the classroom and to continue to get the most out of the education and time that we had available with our students and with our teachers. Sometimes that meant that we had to prioritize kind of the more obvious things first, like how do we set up online meetings, how do we set up classrooms that are digital, and sometimes some of the other bits and pieces were put aside. So how do we do this efficiently? How do we make sure that we maintain things like digital security as we work through these challenges? So digital transformation is really a notion whereby people are looking to achieve certain goals, and let's have a look at what those goals are. So first and foremost, people are looking to combat potentially competitive threats in the marketplace. So that could mean if you're a university or if you're a school, you might have other schools who are doing things better, and people will just typically like to gravitate towards services and tools that enable them to achieve their ultimate goal, their ultimate objectives a little bit more efficiently. So competitive threat is definitely an element for people to drive towards digital transformation. The other thing is the changing environmental risks and challenges. So COVID is a perfect example. We couldn't continue to do what we'd always done with technology. We couldn't continue to protect our devices and protect our information in the same way that we always have. We had to do things differently. Warranty was now no longer something that you could do necessarily on campus. We had to do things with new tools. We had to push software out when people were at home. We had to make sure they were secure when they're at home. We had a lot of different environmental challenges that really forced us to do things in a different way. Another key driver for digital transformation is a desire to do more with less things. How do we improve our operational efficiency? How do we get more out of our people, out of our tools, and out of our resources? And this also talks to the competitiveness. And one of the main other reasons why people embrace digital transformation as an idea is that customers are demanding different things from us. So as your customers, whether they be parents or students, look at the services that you're providing to them, sometimes things have changed. They want different things from you. So these are typically drivers that force people to look at the process of digital transformation and embark on that journey. So if we then move forward and have a look at the goals of a digital transformation, when people decide they're going to do things because these drivers have forced them to consider it, they then look at these goals. First and foremost, they want to engage customers better. People look at the environment and they say, who are our customers? What are they demanding from us? And in the school context, students are demanding the ability to use better devices, things that they have more of an affinity with. People say, I love my device. They don't say, I love my VPN software. They have an affinity with this piece of equipment because it helps them to get things done. Then there's empowering your employees. And we've probably all experienced teachers who've struggled with the digital transformation around COVID. A lot of teachers were struggling with, how do I replace that valuable classroom time with time away from the students? How do I make sure that I'm still engaging with those students? How do we make sure that those teachers are feeling invested in? I saw a stat where a lot of teachers were deciding to retire or resign because they just couldn't get that feeling that they were connecting with their students the way they used to. Another driver for digital transformation is to optimize operations. And that's definitely about how do we take inefficiencies that are in our system today and remove those inefficiencies? How do we do things like gain operational leverage? How do we make sure that our IT department can equip our teachers and our students to do what they're demanding from us without relinquishing control or without creating a whole extra amount of work because we've got to do things differently? And then finally, we also need to transform our products. And in education, that has been absolutely transformed. So no longer are we dictated by IT policies necessarily, by technical capability. So previously, we've had a lot of control over our environment. We've had a lot of control over consistency of the experience. But that has gone away with the advent of things like BYOD and home-based learning. So we need to make sure that we can transform, we can meet the market where it needs to be without relinquishing all of the control and abilities that we've had in the past. So when you talk about digital transformation with a lot of companies, what do they typically talk about? Well, this is what I hear a lot of: cloud, AI, analytics, data, blockchain, all sorts of different pieces. One thing that I find conspicuously missing in most of these conversations is the device. So the device is seen pretty much purely as a commodity. And that to me says that we're trying to optimize a solution without optimizing all of the solution. The device is a critical part of the solution. So why is it treated differently? Especially since we've had so much advancement in the capabilities of the device when it comes to interface ability, security, management, control. Why are we still looking at the devices as if they're all the same as they were 10 years ago? Because they're significantly different. So when people treat devices as commodities, this is typically what happens. So if an IT traditionally wanted to take control of IT, and the devices specifically, what they would do is they'd limit the choice of devices, they'd make them as similar as possible, then they'd create a controlled single image that gets re-engineered on a yearly basis as hardware changes. And they would do that year in and year out. And in order to make sure that they were secure and consistent, they would lock them down as much as possible. So they'd make them consistent and locked down from a software perspective. And then they'd have to work out ways to keep them updated and secure. In a lot of cases, when students were on campus, because you had access to them through your network, that was a lot easier. Now what happens when you have students taking devices home? It's a little bit more complicated. So if that's the process that IT traditionally has followed, then what they did is they went to market and they looked at all of the devices, considered all of them to be similar, minor differences, and this gave them the paradox of choice. There are so many choices out there, but they're all kind of similar. So what are we going to do? Well, what we're going to do is we're going to simplify the device requirements down to spec, and we do that for the purpose of comparison, not because it's necessarily the best spec in the world, but because it's easier to compare when the processors align, the memory aligns, the storage aligns, and we can compare these things easily. And then we can pass that requirement off to procurement, typically, and they'll go out to market with an RFP. And then they'll squeeze the price of those devices down as much as possible. But they're all treated as exactly the same, pretty much. Very minor differences. None of them are going to necessarily deliver a significant multi-factor improvement in the experience that people have and the control that IT is able to apply to those devices. So if that's what they have been faced with and they have then followed this process, there's another alternative, and that is typically BYOD. And BYOD is different even again, and there are a few different variations of BYOD. There's choose your own device, there's bring your own device. And BYOD has really come about through two things: the lack of budget. So we can't afford to provision devices for kids as a school or for students as a school. And there are complexity areas that are just too difficult to address. So we don't want that problem, those operational inefficiencies that I spoke about. We don't want to have to create those images. We don't want to have to worry about the warranty. We don't want to have to worry about those things. And that's great. That removes a lot of complexity out of the IT function. However, the impact on the experience is significant. What it typically meant was you'd have web-based tools that are not really optimized for every experience. So for instance, there would be little pen usage, and we all know there's plenty of research that suggests that people who use digital ink, particularly for subjects where you're dealing with concepts and charts and graphs and working out mind maps and so on, those tools, those analog tools, are really valuable for learning. And if you're doing things like rich media, whether it be 3D, video editing, whatever it happens to be, those web-based tools are not optimized for those things. What IT has typically then done with this BYOD product is they treat every device on the network as if it's hostile. And I've had IT manager after IT manager tell me that this is the approach that they take. And that's because what they're doing is they have no control of the devices that come into the environment. They cannot enforce a policy. They cannot make sure that those devices don't carry malware or viruses, for instance, and they block the traffic as much as humanly possible. They constrain the information flow to that device to just the bits and pieces that are bare minimum. And what that delivers is two things. It delivers a bare minimum of information flow, but also means when a teacher walks into a classroom, they don't know what state the devices are in. They don't know what capabilities the devices have. If the devices are not able to collaborate and interact with teachers who are, for instance, doing Mandarin lessons with handwriting, or music lessons, or chemistry formulas, or whatever it happens to be, then they have to resort to technologies that are not optimized for those types of work, which means that they resort back to things like pen and paper. The final point with BYD is that IT has no dependence or control over the warranty of those devices. So uptime and making sure that those devices are ready to be used, which has a knock-on effect to curriculum. Because if you build a curriculum around devices that are capable of performing certain tasks, then you can take maximum advantage of those technologies. If you have no confidence that the devices have a great capability or that they're always going to be available and ready, then the devices will become a backup to the core teaching process. And we've all seen the SAMR model, which is substitution, augmentation, modification, redefinition. This is kind of a spectrum of how far does the device impact positively the learning process? Is it just a substitute for a book, or does it redefine learning? Does it give us experiences that we've never had before? Because that should be the goal. Incorporate all of these things into a digital transformation process and maximize the goal that you get out of the device and the whole ecosystem together. So this is the ugliest slide that I have in the presentation. This talks to, we've got the old way and we want to get to the new way, but somehow we've decided that commoditizing the PC is a good idea. We're not going to include it in our digital transformation strategy. And that creates a lot of workarounds for the advantages and disadvantages of the individual piece of hardware. So I think it's really important to recognize that hardware designed in conjunction with the software is not always the same as just hardware plus software. So that integrated design, so when you look at things like Microsoft 365, the productivity tools, or the management tools, or the control tools, when they're designed in conjunction with the hardware, you get a significant advantage in the capability of these tools. And it's really important to recognize that there are incremental advantages to be had if you do this together as a single exercise. So I'm just going to talk to you about a couple of different elements of digital transformation and where you can see differences when you integrate the hardware as part of the conversation. The first one, which is centered around empowering the users to get more and engage their customers or engage your customers. And this is just some research from external parties that say that Surface users report 86% improved employee satisfaction when they're using Surface combined with 365 versus other devices. That's a significant advantage. So when we spoke about the teachers earlier who were struggling with how do I engage with my students, for teachers to feel invested in and to feel empowered to use a device that has a multimodal interface, they can continue to explain concepts the same way they always have, but now they can do it remotely. That's a really important thing for staff retention. 90% of parents also state that Surface one-to-one programs have exceeded their expectations. And that's because once they see their students start to engage with Surface and integrate Surface in the learning process, they're seeing that there are these little incremental experience differences that go beyond the specification that we normally focus on. So that commoditization piece where we just look at the CPU and the storage versus when you look at the capabilities of the device, which includes great quality cameras, great quality audio so that I don't have to kind of really listen in to make sure that I understand, the ability to use digital link and collaborate. These experiential elements to the hardware and how it leads into the capabilities of the software are really important. And this is important to make sure that that digital transformation satisfies the needs of your staff and your customers, which is your students. And probably one of the best things about Surface is the security story, because being designed together with Windows and the Microsoft security tools such as Endpoint Manager, it means that you have this integrated solution all the way from what we're calling silicon to cloud. And if we look at some research from third-party entities, which I've only recently discovered, some of it's kind of alarming. The first one is a study by Forrester that suggests that 63% of companies have already experienced a data compromise or breach in the last 12 months through a hardware or silicon level breach. So you can patch your operating system as much as you like, is what they're saying. But if you leave the hardware as you always have, without an upgrade policy in place, then you are at risk. A lot of people have already been compromised. And to look forward to the future, Gartner suggests that by next year, 70% of enterprises without a firmware upgrade plan will be breached due to a firmware vulnerability. 70% is a huge number of all enterprises that don't have an upgrade plan will be breached. And the final study on this page is from Wired, the publication Wired, that looked at the firmware code that's used on PCs out there in the market. And what they say is that 80% of PCs share their code in the firmware. So that means if a breach is exploitable on one, it's most likely exploitable on another. Now, why is Surface different here? Well, first things first is when it comes to a firmware upgrade plan, because Surface has an in-house written firmware, and because it integrates with all of those tools, the Surface firmware is seamlessly updated via Windows Update for Business. So that means that you as an IT person don't need to worry about this emerging firmware-based threat in your environment. A great example is a large customer in Australia who I spoke to a few years ago. And I said, what is your plan if you encounter a firmware breach on a non-Surface device? And there were tens of thousands of users using devices in this entity. And his response was, we hope it never happens, which is clearly alarming for him. So after we had that conversation, and I spoke to him just again recently, and he's implemented this particular setup for his Surface devices. And he said he doesn't even worry about it anymore because he knows that the Surface firmware is always updated and always ready to be managed remotely, which is fantastic. The second piece of information is about the 80% of devices sharing the same firmware code. And as I've just mentioned, Microsoft make their own firmware. So it is unique to Surface, and these capabilities can be unique capabilities. There are other vendors who do similar things, but if you want to investigate what Surface does, there are plenty of unique capabilities built into Surface with regard to firmware management. This leads to a claim that we make about chip to cloud security, which integrates your transformation. And you can see in the top diagram here, there are some uniquenesses to Surface, for instance, in the way we integrate with some of the other tools. The end result is that Forrester suggests that there's a 20% reduction in security breaches for Surface users a 17% decrease in endpoint security spend, and a 14% reduction in MDM spend. So you can save money because you may already be licensed to use these tools, depending on what level of M365 you're currently using. And you can just integrate these tools together to give you a greater level of security. When it comes to deployment and optimizing your operations, Forrester have also suggested that there's a 62% reduction in deployment cost when you use things like Autopilot. Surface and Autopilot were delivered in conjunction with each other, and they deliver a 25% reduction of IT time when configuring a Surface device, 112% ROI on Surface when using M365, and it takes out, with Surface in particular, because of the signature image that we use, we take out that yearly kind of deployment rhythm that you've got to go through. And if you think to yourself, how often or how much time and energy do I spend collecting drivers, building an image, getting it ready for deployment? If you imagine that you never had to do that again, and you could repurpose that time to do more important things, to facilitate teaching and learning, and make sure that your customers who consume your services are better prepared, then that is an incredible advantage to look at. So consider the time that you spend on deployment is usually fairly significant, which means it's a significant cost. And if you can reduce that cost and put that money elsewhere to improve your services, then that will be a significant advantage to you. Next, what we're going to do is we're going to talk to a couple of our specialists in Australia who are going to tell us some stories about the experiences that their customers have had using some of these tools with Surface to help transform their operations.
Hi, my name is Belinda Gorsevsky. I'm a Surface Device Specialist at Microsoft. Today I'm here to talk to you about a true digital transformation from one of our customers in New South Wales. They're a private school with over 1,200 students. Traditionally, they had a BYOD program with mandated specs that provided to parents to head out into retail to purchase. IT had little to no control over these devices, and teachers weren't sure on what device was going to enter the classroom. They had a challenge and they wanted to transform. They wanted to create an environment that allowed digital technology to be entered into the classroom, but also maximize it to their best benefit. The challenge was they weren't. With their current BYOD program, the devices were fragmented, and it meant that teachers found it extremely difficult to create lesson plans using those devices because they didn't want to exclude someone based on the products that they had. Students were lucky to bring their device. There was many classes that they weren't using the products or computers in those sessions. So they would just leave them uncharged in their backpack and never bring them out. And parents felt angry because their money that they had invested in these devices weren't being used. IT was concerned. They wanted to be involved, but they also knew they had a very small bandwidth and didn't want to put extra pressure on themselves. But we helped them along the way. Together with a Surface Education reseller, we conducted some surveys to identify what the requirements of devices the students, teachers, and IT needed in their school. We quickly found that a portable, thin, light device was something that students really wanted, and teachers wanted a device with consistent input methods and making sure that there is a capability of writing, inking, and voice to meet all students' requirements. IT were obviously very concerned. Moving towards a BYOD program to a one-to-one was going to be very stressful for them if they looked at a traditional method. Fortunately, Microsoft and our Surface Education reseller came together to help and support the deployment of these devices. Together with Intune and Autopilot, we were able to minimize and streamline the deployment process for this school and maximize these technologies to create an awesome deployment, only down to 10 minutes per device. With 1,200 units, every single minute counts, and it means that those IT department had a very hands-off experience. Students were able to log into their devices with their school credentials and boot up the product and have an amazing boot up experience. Teachers were able to now have a consistent form factor and allow them to create lesson plans that supported the capabilities of each and every student, but also taking it in that next step rather than just using a piece of paper or pen. They're able to use the devices to create and write and maximize that software. Not only were the students and teachers able to get amazing educational benefits from this, but with the troubling times of COVID, IT needed to push out and create new scenarios on the go. Because they had conducted modern management and because we were able to push out updates and software online, they were managed to turn on a full Teams deployment within less than 12 hours when we had to go into lockdown for COVID. This school has not only transformed from an educational standpoint, IT have truly transformed. Thanks to Surface, our Surface education resellers, we were able to really create a true digital transformational story. Thank you.
Thanks, Belinda. Really appreciate you giving us that input. Now let's have a chat with Damien and see what he's got to tell us.
Hi, my name is Damien and I'm the Surface Specialist for Education here at Microsoft Australia. I'd like to, if it's okay, just share a story about one of the customers from a conversation we had here in Sydney quite recently. This particular customer is a K-12 school. They have about 1,000 students, about 120 teachers, and they have a new principal. The conversation that I had originally was with the IT manager of that school, and I found out that that particular school has some very old devices for the staff, and that IT manager was looking to refresh those devices with something new. The conversations took a very quick turn as soon as we had met the principal. So the principal was in the midst of completing a complete transformation of the school itself. There was very little technology that the school had used, and he was really keen on implementing new technology for really the enablement and the betterment of the school in general. And so the conversation quickly steered away from device in a silo to device effectively as a whole. So how will the device sit within which is the principal's, how will the device fit within my framework for the school moving forward? And the principal was really looking for a couple of things. One was that the devices were fit for purpose from a teaching perspective. That was very important. So are they light? Are they agile? And particularly, we want to use OneNote. And so how can we, what type of use cases can we have from a touch and an inking perspective within the class itself? And from an IT perspective, the IT manager, being quite light on resources, was really interested in how am I going to manage these devices with low resources, and how are we going to ensure that these devices are compliant as well with things like updates and applications, etc. And so the benefit that we propose to the principal of Surface with Intune and Autopilot in particular is a huge boon. It's something that we think is going to fit right within the strategy that you have of really revolutionizing the school to become a pillar within the community from a digital perspective. And so the conversation was that, look, let's get Autopilot and Intune set up for you. Let's support that through a Surface Education reseller partner who will be able to help you. They have expertise within Autopilot and Intune to do that work. Let's develop some policies and profiles for your particular users. And then when you have your Surface devices, you'll be able to automatically push those policies and processes, etc., onto those devices to your teachers, so that your teachers simply have to turn on the device and effectively log into their device, and away they go. And so we executed on that, and we executed in a very, very short period of time. I think from the first conversation to, putting devices in the teacher's hands for use was probably about a month and a half, 6 weeks. But post deployment, what's been really, really cool for that particular school and also that IT manager has been that there has been delight and surprise. So from an IT perspective, the IT manager there uses Intune. They're able to fully manage all of the compliance of their devices, and not just compliance, but are things like firmware updates completed, has Windows updates completed, who hasn't completed their updates. I can force those updates on those devices. Which devices haven't been connected for a long time? Are they outside of the range of normal use? So there's a lot of security and compliance features within Intune as well that you can turn on and off as you will. And the really cool thing, let's argue for a second that a particular device has gone missing. That's IT manager can remotely do things to that device, like for instance, automatically erase all of the data on that drive, as an example, through the Surface data eraser. So some really, really cool features that are unique to Surface through Autopilot and Intune that particular IT manager has been able to use. From a principal's perspective, he is super happy because he's effectively modernized his entire fleet of devices for the staff. So the staff are obviously happy as well. But also he's done that in a very compliant and sustainable way. This is effectively a way that he's able to now scale for the students. So the students is phase 2 rollout for him and for that particular school. And so now they'll be able to do that in a very scalable and efficient way, as far as making sure that devices are properly compliant, they're imaged correctly, and the students have a surprise and delight as far as not having to worry about any of the configuration of that device. It's completely managed through the cloud. I hope that this has been of some benefit to you as far as the story. If you would like to know more, if there's any way that we can help you here at Microsoft, please feel free to reach out to us or one of our Surface Education reseller partners at your will, and we're more than happy to engage and have a chat. Thank you and goodbye.
Thanks, Damien. So in summary, what we'd like to do is we'd like to emphasize that you should not treat your devices as commodities, because they are really an integral part to your digital transformation journey. You can only truly deliver those digital transformation objectives when you integrate the device as part of that conversation. So if you'd like to talk to any of the specialists you've seen on this video or myself, please reach out to us. Have a great day.